Hello, everyone. My crew, my Columbia room crew. Good to see you all. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. We are here to review Proposal C in the Clackamas room. So what are some thoughts?
Sorry, Karina, just one thing. This is not my normal room. It's totally fine, but I wasn't sure if that was on purpose or not.
Were you in the last meeting? Was this the room that you were in the last meeting?
No.
Yeah, we did a switch up in the last meeting to ensure, because what we heard is that there were some over representation of school communities in certain groups. So we're just kind of, there was a shuffling that was done prior to the last meeting. Yeah.
No problem.
Okay. Anyone want to start? What are some key attributes and of this proposal that work well for your community? Let's start with the good news. What are things you like? Yeah, Harmony.
I just said good news. I have a clarifying
Sure.
question. So is Atkinson then, is the assumption that we can hold that this would be a four-stranded program, to neighborhood and to okay. So in the positive, I think, well, that certainly kind of solves the problem of single-stranded. I'll say I didn't realize we had capacity for that, which the numbers look very high, right on the edge, right? 96% or something. So I'll stop there with my positive of no single strand.
Okay. Anyone else? What are some good attributes of this one?
This is Christy from Creative Science. So for our community, it would be close. So hopefully a lot of our families that have been there for a while would be more likely to be able to stay in the community. So proximity to the existing Clark building. Yep.
Chris.
Hi, I'm representing Lane, and this proposal will increase our enrollment to get us up around that 500 level.
Awesome. Okay. Anyone else want to talk about positive attributes or what elements of this you like? Seeing something in the chat. Oh, no worries, Sandra. Now I'm seeing hands. Okay. Dee Dee.
I feel like of all the plans that we've seen so far, I think it's the only one that is, I think it's the most sensitive to the fact that there is a neighborhood, like draw a Bridger outside of the DLI. And so it was just really nice to see something on the table that doesn't just disperse that part of our school to the winds.
Thank you. Sam.
Sure, thank you. I'll just reiterate that this proposal C seems to have an initial positive perception by the CSS community.
Okay, thank you. Beth.
For Hosford, a positive is I know that the Mandarin immersion program is, a vital part of the community. And so having it there is important to folks.
Okay. Chris, you've got your hand up again. Is that you have another thought?
Yes, just because there's nobody in this group from Whitman, but that's my other school of my heart. But our enrollment also is brought up to a better number for an elementary school, and that's a lovely thing. Although I have to say our boundaries look like one of the more interesting. Crazy
Geographically interesting.
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else who hasn't had a chance to speak want to talk about sort of some positive attributes before we move to some challenges?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sandra, I see your hand.
I was just going to say that it seems in this proposal like there was a lot of careful consideration to some of the feedback that's been received. I see that in a lot of different areas, and that's appreciated. And I also appreciated the fact that this is the only proposal that doesn't completely get rid of Bridger's neighborhood program.
Thank you. There was somebody that was speaking when there was another voice.
It was me. Sorry.
Oh, hey, Leah.
I think you know, my specifically the
Uh-oh.
Chinese speaking families in my DLI program remaining in our boundary area, and so
Uh-oh. I'm having a hard time hearing you, Leah. I don't know if others are as well. Was she choppy for others? Yeah,
Yes,
maybe
she
try
is.
turning, Leah, maybe try turning your video off and then come back to us. See if we can get better sound out of you.
I just
Oh,
piggyback real quick on Sam's comment that we had a PTA meeting last night, and the initial feedback from the neighborhood families also was really positive, because the idea of having a program back in the Bridger neighborhood that might help retain some enrollment within the neighborhood boundaries felt really appealing.
okay. Chris, your hand up again? No, okay. Oh, that's okay, no worries. Anyone else hasn't had a chance to speak tonight? Elizabeth, Sandra, I think maybe we did hear from you, Sandra. Michelle. Okay. What about any, what I'm going to call them, attributes of concern? Anything that is concerning to you or that you don't feel is in the best interest of either your community or the Southeast as a whole? Chris.
So it's possible that that having a enrollment over 500 is it's not possible that we would remain a Title I school. It could be that those two elements are mutually exclusive, but we do worry at Lane that should we lose our Title I status, that a lot of the resources that are really benefiting our students won't be available to us. I've taught in the past at a school that just lost its Title I status, and it's a really uncomfortable place to be.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Beth.
Sorry. So for Hosford, we stay at a very high enrollment level at 98%. That's where we were in my kiddos' 6th grade year, and we had really big class sizes, no place to go, pretty uncomfortable level of enrollment at 98%. So I think that would be a concern for Hosford. And more generally speaking, I really struggle with the middle school DLI programs being split between 2 different middle schools, having 2 small Spanish and 2 small Mandarin immersion programs rather than one robust one for each of those languages. And then seeing the multiple DLI programs at Harrison Park, it feels like a lot of sort of chaos around middle school DLI.
Okay. Thank you. Harmony.
I'm noticing, especially the schools that went from K-8 to K-5, that they become very small. You know, often under that 270 threshold. And yeah, I worry about the ability to even provide those robust elementary programs at those schools that turn from K to, so Creston, Marysville, Arleta, and then you have other schools that are at super high capacity. I do appreciate that most of the boundaries look like boxes or along major roadways. That's a great positive. I think there's still a couple wonky spaces, but for the most part, it looks much more like good to the eye, which I think is what we're all looking
Inner
for too.
boundaries,
I mean,
yeah.
and for like safe
Mhm.
safe routes to schools, right? Like that's why we've been talking about it. So
Okay. Sam, I think you were next.
Well, now I feel terrible, but you know, that's part of the drill. One concern might be, we hope these numbers are absolutely super right, I guess, when it comes to coming into a new building vis-a-vis the current amount of students that will be there or remain or whatever, wherever a place like CSS or something that's moving winds up moving. But I'm just hoping that there's data security in these decisions, and I hope we don't uncover something that might blow the lid wide open. And the thing that maybe was going to make me sound like a jerk is I also was wondering, like, right after Harmony said that, is that at what I heard in the presentation, I heard safe routes to schools, these boundaries sort of mentioned like 10 times as like a crutch to getting some smooth numbers. And so, you know, I'm wondering what does, I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, but like, what does maybe fudging that a little bit here and there look like as it relates to like being the group being like, oh, you know, if we had that, we could offer you and like have all these like utopian numbers, because we decided that maybe in an area or two a road can be crossed. But I can't believe I'm saying that out loud, but it's just interesting that was as sort of mentioned as a crutch or whatever the right word is throughout the presentation. So it's just interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the drivers, obviously, for the district from a safety standpoint is ensuring that kids and families aren't crossing major thoroughfares, right? Yeah, that has been a driver. Jed?
Well, yeah, Karina, that's a really, really good point, Sam. And something that I always want to point out to folks is, you know, there are limitations and projections of enrollment, 5 years out, right? And so when you're looking at a school that's, at 260, just 10 students below, I would consider that, right? Like how much play is in there, really, and if you're really kind of teetering on the edge there, I think that there could be an argument made that we don't have a crystal ball about whether or not those 10 kids actually show up in that school 5 years from now. So give ourselves a little bit of space there, just understanding that it is indeed a projection.
Thanks for addressing that, Jed. Appreciate it.
Chris? No worries. Take your time. Oh, no. Okay. Sandra.
Two quick things. Yeah, sorry. You can see me in my glory sets. You're talking to a person. I'm here.
I appreciate that. I was talking about hand.
Yeah, a real hand. Two things. So one, to kind of, I guess, piggyback on Sam's comment. Sam, I don't think you're a bad person for saying that at all. I think, one of the things that Jed has pointed out, and I think what we're seeing in proposal C is kind of an opposite of what we saw in the other proposals, where those big streets weren't necessarily taken into an account. And at that point we were saying, well, hey, there's no lights on or crosswalks on, Woodstock for this section. Well, any more than they they couldn't know anymore that there were no crosswalks in that 20 block section, and they can know that the 20 blocks preceding that are incredibly crossable. It's the same street, a 5 minute, 5 mile an hour difference, but two completely like different experiences. That was like something we were talking about in my 10-minute meetup. Like the kids that would be crossing from Lewis, that would go to Lewis now, that would go to Woodstock, where they're crossing is totally safe, not a problem. But the kids that would be crossing from south of Woodstock, or have been crossing from south of Woodstock to attend Arleta, that's a different experience. So I don't think, there's the limitations of the data there. And I think that we really have to rely on our people on the streets. So like our families and our neighborhoods to tell us like, hey, that's a really bad spot. And that's why a lot of that ends up being kind of tweaked later in the process. But my question, because I have those same feelings like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. But at the same time, Grace to Flo, like they can't walk every street. They don't know what it looks like. So yeah, we're gonna have to be helpers at that point, like saying like that doesn't work or that does work. Because nobody wants pancake kids, and we all want decent enrollment. My question though, and I guess it's really for you, Jed, through Flo, is that my recollection at the beginning of this process was that you guys had identified a couple of Southeast Portland schools, I believe Marysville and Arleta among them, as actually having rising enrollment forecasts. But when I'm going through these numbers, I'm not really seeing any rising enrollment numbers.
Yeah, there are a couple areas in the kind of middle southeast where there is slightly rising enrollment, but it's often washed out when you are redrawing the boundaries, because the overall trend in the region is actually lower enrollment. So yeah,
Okay.
We're just tending not to see it come out unless you package just the right areas together.
Okay.
To get that increase.
Okay, I appreciate the clarification because we've had questions about that. So.
Jed, can you lend some clarity to this whole Bridger capacity?
Yeah, yeah. So I was just typing in the chat. The 361 number, I'll need to look into that one, Beth, but I can tell you the 510 number. So I was talking with the facilities staff through Judy to get some clarity on this piece. So without portables, 413, with the newer portables, the quote unquote good portables, that brings you up to 510. And then there's some older portables. I think they're from even like the 70s or something, that get you up to 561 is the total functional capacity of Bridger.
Okay. And so when on the summary statistics where it says building capacity without modulars, that means actually with new modulars, but not the old modulars?
Yeah, I think that
Yes.
one's got the little
Asterisk.
the asterisks there. That's like, hey, we had to add that extra piece in there for it to make sense, or to be able to like include all of the creative science students and the neighborhood kids there.
Okay. Okay, the difference between new modulars and old modulars is where I was lost. Okay.
Yeah, there's a little asterisk,
I
but
see the asterisk, but it still doesn't say old, it just says with or without modulars. I didn't know there were two separate sets of modulars at Bridger, that we were counting some or.
yeah.
Yeah, that's new news.
Christy,
Can I ask what
Go ahead.
separates those old from the new ones? Are the new ones insulated, for instance, or are there more energy efficient features?
yeah.
And accessibility, probably.
Yeah, it was an age distinction that John Lyons, the facilities manager, shared with me.
Yeah, and I would
ahead.
say traditionally Cherry Pass, that is, there's what we call kind of buildings that are beyond their useful life, right? And that is because of installation, because of just the deterioration of the materials, quite frankly. And then there are the newer ones tend to have better acoustic attenuation, better insulation, ADA access. That happens to all of them, but in some cases the ramps aren't great to some of the older ones. So even though they are technically ADA accessible, they achieve that through some rather wonky ways. So those are kind of the things that we look at for the viability, if you will, of a portable.
Director DePass, I would just say though, having spent a lot of time in all three of those portables personally, is that I'm not sure that if you didn't know what age they were, they look pretty comparable. There isn't sort of like one that looks like significantly deteriorated from the rest of them. They're all in pretty good condition.
Yeah, I think so. I used to work for a consulting company that did energy efficiency assessments. And so the mobile home question comes up about what the useful life is for a building that was built before like 1985 or whatever. And so I was curious if the same improvements were on the modernized ones, had bigger doorways, for instance, and better ramping and more insulation.
They tend to have more insulation. They don't necessarily have bigger doors, better ramping, things of that nature.
Interesting. Thank you.
Christy.
One of the concerns that came up with Bridger early on was the portables. And I guess the district's, what I was told is the district was trying to move away from portable use in this enrollment and balancing process. So I guess like what is the reasoning behind moving away from that? And would this then result in another just temporary fix if the ultimate end goal is to get to a place without using modulars? So early on in the process, I heard that was what excluded Bridger as a location, is because they were not wanting to use modulars anymore. And would this once again make it for creative science to always have a temporary place where they're going to need to move again because of capacity and modulars?
Yeah, Christy, that's definitely a conversation that was had as, folks were discussing, like, is there another potential location? And it was not ideal because, yes, we've been trying to avoid the use of modulars in this, but that's kind of where the discussion came up, like what are the newer modulars that if this needed to be looked at as an option, like, there are currently students in these modulars right now. And with creative science having a component that is lottery enrolled, the district actually can, kind of control how many kids are coming into that school. So maybe over time, reduce enrollment such that, it wouldn't be absolutely necessary to rely on those modulars. If that makes sense.
And will you confirm, I believe this is true, but in the model, what I'm going to call C2, the K5 CSS model, Bridger would not need the modulars in the long run.
That's right. Yep. That's another reason for looking at that. And I just pulled up just more detail for folks on the portables at Bridger. So there are three, they're broken out in three different units. One from 1966, which is not part of the calculation that includes 513. And then the other two are from 2007 and 2018.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I haven't heard from you tonight. Hi.
I've been uncharacteristically quiet. I'm just trying to learn. Does the conversation about portable signal a pivot in the part of PPS that there's a tolerance for portables on a temporary basis? And I say that because I think that given some of the size limitations, even though they're not the best outcome, maybe they're a tolerable outcome to help transition some things. If they're, in light of the absence of the perfect, maybe they're okay for a short term. So I'm just wondering if that's signaling, because we started out with PPS being pretty adamant about we don't want portables. And then the one thing I would note of concern is the impact of the enrollment numbers on Mount Tabor in number C and what that does to its funding model. And in this model, what I'd heard previously was that Mount Tabor would come back up above 500 at some point, but this one, it doesn't show it doing that. So would that be a permanent decline in enrollment anticipated?
Yeah, so Elizabeth, to answer the question about Mount Tabor there, yeah, that's based on the drawing of the boundary and the fact that it only has one feeder, neighborhood feeder in Glencoe. Yeah, that's it's projected to be lower than 500. Yes, of course, like I mentioned, like we don't know exactly what those numbers will be, but that is the anticipation. And I believe that we saw something similar in another of the proposals as well, a pretty low enrollment when we just have a single neighborhood feeder going to Mount Tabor along with the Japanese immersion program.
Yeah, there's some conversation going on in the chat, and Leah, I want to get your input on this because they're specifically talking about dual strands or 2 DLI programs at Harrison Park. And I know that you definitely would have some opinion about that because that is currently what you have. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it would be at the middle school level. We would have, 2 DLI programs, and I know Mount Tabor currently has that. I think what I'll say is just it has to be supported by the district, and understanding that that's another layer of complexity in scheduling, and also just for support for teachers learning and professional development. And I think also culturally being really mindful of that. So it all comes down to the support that we, whoever has from the district. And yeah, it is kind of a big deal.
The other thing I want to add, Leah, is the fact that oftentimes people, either by design or by default, prefer one of the languages over the other. So, and that's what they have happening at Mount Tabor. So you end up not being able to support the one that is less desirable. And it becomes a real challenge for the kids who are in that program. It also becomes a real challenge for administration as they try to create a master schedule. So
and I think, yeah.
So that's why the advocacy for one language at a middle school came up.
Yeah. And I think that also just being, and that's a broad picture from the district, is having some discussion around at what point do you make decisions to, like, for example, if you only have 10, 15 kids at a grade level, do we start combining class, grade levels, those types of things, and getting some more guidance from the DLI department around that, so that it's not just a building administrator making those decisions, and that we kind of have some things in place so that it's more streamlined throughout the district.
Can we get PPS, either you, Leah, or you, Dr. O, to confirm that at the middle schools, all DLI programs are for 2 periods a day? That is correct.
Yes, most of them are.
Okay, so we are confirmed there. I see your hand up, Beth, but I'm going to go to Sam because, go ahead, Dr. O.
I see a question here. He said, can you talk more about what you mean by one program? Did I just, one program?
What language is preferred over another, I think is what you were saying, right?
So let us assume that you have, say, Japanese and French. Families decide on which of the languages they want their child to be enrolled in, right? And what happens over time is that because of the decisions and choices that families make, one language ends up having more students. And that's why I said it's preferred by one group of the community over the other. And that's what we have at Mount Tabor. They have a whole lot more students in the Japanese program and fewer students in the Spanish program. Now, if the Spanish program would probably move to a different middle school, maybe they would have a whole lot more people interested. So that's all I was trying to say about it.
I feel like it's a false equivalency to say preference, because there's only so many, because they're feeder programs, right? So there's only a single strand that's feeding to Mount Tabor, not because they're, not because there isn't interest in Spanish immersion. There's a long wait list for those Spanish immersion programs, right? But it's just that you have a whole school of Japanese feeding the middle school and only one strand from Atkinson feeding, right? So it's also about, like, I just think it's not necessarily appropriate to say preference, because there's
It's
only
also in
so
how
many
you
spots,
matriculate,
right?
right? Mhm.
Right, and there's only so many spots at, you know, where there are huge wait lists at Atkinson, and Bridger, and, you know. So.
And the reason I said preference is because as a parent, I do believe we make choices. Your child could matriculate from one school to the other in a certain language configuration, and you could change your mind and decide, you know what, we really do have a very strong Spanish foundation at home. So rather than having my child continue with Japanese, I'm going to have them switch over. So that's why I said preference. Yes, matriculation plays a role, but I also believe that parents can make a choice. There are also kids who are not necessarily in one or the other, who can opt for, say, Spanish or Japanese, right? Based on whatever elective they've had or whatever experiences they've had in the past. So that's the only reason I said preference. It doesn't mean that preference is the reason everybody makes those choices or that that program is smaller. There are other factors that govern it, as you rightfully said.
Sam, you got your hand up.
Hi, again. One area of concern is C2 and how it keeps this long tail of conversation about splitting creative science school into a K-5 and a middle school at two separate locations. Just want to reiterate that the community wants to remain a K-8 institution throughout this process. And so all of this C2 talk is just sort of makes us nervous. And it seems like all of the data presented by PPS has all these highlights that's said to say this is not the best idea. And, you know, be nice to just factor that in. I would like to say that a positive, if we can go back to one of those, is that in initial reactions from the CSS community, we don't mind modulars. It's not a make or break thing. It's fine if that's what it takes. And I need to use this moment to say that it's hard for me to participate in this forum with such a robust chat going on. I feel like this was mentioned in the an all-up meeting as well. I just can't. It belittles or undercuts the whole forum that we're trying to use. If when I'm talking, there's like hundreds of words being mentioned in the chat, and then questions are answered.
Yeah, I would agree.
I just don't. It's getting real messy, and there's just so much content, and it's probably hard for YouTubers. And I'm just throwing that out there. It's just seems like it's getting worse and worse. Thank you.
I would encourage folks to hold off. We've got plenty of time tonight to try and limit what you're putting in the chat, and let's just have an open conversation about it. I know, Beth, you've actually been had your hand up, so I'm going to let you catch up.
And thank you for bringing that up. I apologize. I'm absolutely guilty of using the chat. My intention is like clarifying to not like disturb the flow of the conversation, and I see how that's being read. So I appreciate that feedback. Thank you. And I wanted to just ask Sam if you could, I wanted to follow up with something you mentioned about that the data presented shows like supports the K-8 model. And I mean, I'm just curious what you mean by that. Because when I'm looking at the data, I mean, I mentioned earlier, I have some bigger questions about what's going on with what's cited at Harrison Park in terms of multiple dual language immersion programs and things like that. But based on what we know about the building capacity at Bridger with modulars, and it doesn't seem that looking at creative science as a K-5 is a negative in that data.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess it's just all the highlights and where they're pointing our eyes when we look at that is somewhere I see high utilization at Harrison Park, which is the school we're trying to solve for, and low utilization at Bridger, which is a problem they see anyway. I don't know. It just, if we're trying to hit numbers, it just seems like it's being presented as those numbers not hitting.
Yeah, I do agree
But
that,
you know, whatever, it's just an initial
no.
reaction. And like I said, I'm just
no, I think that's really fair.
trying to maintain us as a K-8 community as much as I possibly can throughout this process.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. It's not like an easy, this table isn't an easy, like, you just do that. But I think, like I said, there's other potential
Yeah,
conversations.
there are attributes of it that we need to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dee, you have your, actually Christy had her hand up first and then I'll go to you, Dee.
I guess I want to go back to the conversation about the benefits of whole school DLI and some of our metrics in terms of our social justice and serving our BIPOC families. And it does seem in this scenario that we're not hitting it. And just going back to the benefits for our second language learners, is this model and C gonna, I guess, achieve the benefits that we were originally talking about?
Yeah, so you're talking about essentially the ResJ metrics. The ResJ metrics for this one are, for C are, I believe, across the board lower than they are for A and B. Is that right, Judd?
Yeah, they are a little bit lower in some cases. Yes.
D.
I guess I wanted to also try to bring the discussion back a little bit more to the ResJ lens, because I feel like one of the things about proposal C that is bothersome to the Bridger community is just that, like, well, there was a lot of work that we put into when we did the placements for the DLIs in phase 1, and the ResJ lens for Spanish at Kellogg, it's really disappointing to see. It feels like there are lots of reasons why the other DLI and focus programs have to have certain things, and it feels like it's coming at the expense of the Spanish programs. It's like somehow the perception is that they're portable and they're intact and they don't need or deserve any of the continuity or the community preservation that the other programs are getting. And so I just find it really frustrating that there isn't a single scenario on the table that leaves a robust Spanish program at Kellogg, because the reality is for elementary strands, by the time you hit the middle school era, just with natural attrition, the classes go from 28 to 20, 18, 19, 20. And so you do end up consolidating down to 2 to 3 strands. And there's just a lot of, having a kid at Kellogg, the balance that's there right now, which seems to be roughly like 25 to 30% of the Spanish immersion and the 60 to 70% of neighborhood, it just feels like a really robust, diverse experience that the kids are having there. And it feels like a win from the initial placements that we did. And so I just think that it's disservice to the program to not at least consider scenarios that retain it at Kellogg. Not to say that that has to happen, but it's just not on the table. And I feel like the disappointing thing is I feel like as a community, we've really come to this process with a lot of grace and flexibility and a desire to really leave a legacy for the DLI program that's positive and effective in the Southeast Corridor. And it feels like what's happening is that that's getting translated into giving putting a strand at Atkinson when we're having a hard time finding native speaking staff feels really counterproductive to me, to add resources to a school that there's no justification for sort of having, other than just to try to have a balanced co-location. There's no effective justification for having a program in that location. And so to add enrollment closer in Southeast at the expense of not trying to concentrate the DLI teaching staff that we have, for instance, in a community like Lens or something that's closer to that community, feels like a disservice to me, to the program, and to the English language learners. And I just, at the expense of not wanting to talk about the DLI all the time, I just think it's really important to understand that there's some very intentional RESJ work that went into placing those strands in Kellogg in the first place. And it's not a matter of just moving those kids and those families and those programs around like chess pieces. And I would just like to understand why that we seem to be the most mobile of everybody.
Thanks, Steve. Wow. It's important. Okay, anyone else? Was there anything that you talked about in your, as we only have a few minutes now left, maybe 3 or 4, and then we'll give you an option to come back because we're running early. And so we'll have a poll as we get back together about whether or not we need more time. So I'm going to say maybe we need more time. Yeah, Chris, you've got about, oh, no, you won't have any time. You've got about 8 seconds. We'll come back. All right. Hello, y'all. All right, Chris, we left you mid-breath last time. I told you we'd come back. What do you got?
Thank you. So I realize that I'm now a little puzzled, or I'm not, I think I'm confused about the distinction in terms of a ResJ lens, the distinction between the DLI strands and ELL students. I feel like I just might have, my ears might have been hearing wrong. I felt like I was hearing the DLI strands talked about as though they represented the ELL students, which is one of our focuses around justice. Am I hearing that wrong? Because to me, they're not the same thing.
Jed?
You are correct, Chris. They are not the same thing. The assumption is that if we have our ESL students in the DLI program, their language needs will be met because they are immersed in the DLI program. However, you do have to have explicit instruction and strategies to help ESL students, and the DLI program doesn't necessarily provide that.
Right. Plus, there's so many languages that we can't provide the DLI option for.
Right.
So I guess I just wanted to make sure that when we talked about where the DLI students were at, that it's part of our justice lens, but it's not all of it. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Harmony.
Can I get some clarifications? I heard some comments about staffing challenges for DLI programs, especially at middle school. And I hear that there's challenges, but then there's the discussion of having them at multiple school sites offered opportunity to grow. I misunderstood or was confused by the comments around.
I can, if it's okay, I can try to explain part of that. Because I saw a DLI program in another district, and the problem that we routinely ran into in middle schools was because the teachers have to teach, for example, a single subject like history, but if they have to teach it in the target language like Spanish, they have to be authorized to do both. So it's already, in many cases, it's hard enough to find someone that has the language authorization to teach Spanish, for example, and then you're trying to find someone that is Spanish with a single subject history credential, for example. So just being able to find that kind of, that aligning of the stars like becomes more challenging in trying to fill a position. That's what it was. At least that's
with that. Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I think that also makes. We had already talked in this group prior about the challenges of having multiple DLI programs in a single school, right? And that this is another element of that, right? Like the challenges around staffing, but also scheduling, right? Electives for kids. If it's just such a small program at a school, you can't provide the robust options for students in DLI, right? Like you need more kids in DLI so that you can schedule it more, their Spanish classes more than a single period a day, so that they can have elective options, right? Okay.
Okay, Beth, I'm moving us to, Jed was kind enough to put the comparison ResJ measures, impact measures on each of the proposals. So I'm moving that to the center of our board as well.
Okay. My question was kind of a next steps question. Like what tools do we have to sort of synthesize these three proposals and these pros and cons that we're talking about, and like which elements we may want to be pulling out and pulling together, and after we're hearing the community feedback, what should we be coming back prepared to do? When and how do we create this, proposal D?
Right, let's table that till because one of the things we're going to be doing next is talking about next steps once we get out of these groups. So,
okay.
Yeah. Anyone else, want to talk specifically to some of these ResJ, racial equity impact measures, what you're seeing in comparison from one to the other?
Esther, could you clarify what you had said to Chris? I got lost in that thread somewhere. Are we saying that the DLI programs, the location of them is we're no longer doing that using the ResJ lens?
No, Chris's question was around services to ESL students as opposed to DLI students. So what we have right now with our DLI programs is that we have our ESL students embedded in that same program. But the need for the ESL student academically is very different from the need for the DLI student academically. You do have to provide specific instruction in English for the ESL student because they are trying to access content. Where with the DLI student, they already have a very strong language base that allows them to access content. They're just trying to learn language. So sometimes when you have both of them in the same program, the needs of the ESL student is not necessarily being met. They benefit because they are immersed, so they pick up the language, but they don't necessarily have
the content, the content knowledge.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying, Dee.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay. Anyone else want to speak to what you see before you, or any observations here, positive, negatives about proposal C or any of the other proposals? I'll zoom in actually on C, just because that's the one we're talking about here.
I do think, it's interesting because the places where we're not meeting the metrics, like for middle school enrollment is one that stands out, is at Mount Tabor and Selwood, where we've got some of the most affluent and highest white populations. And so I guess when I'm thinking about that, it's like, if our balancing, if we're unable to sort of balance enrollment so that every middle school has a robust, is over that 500 threshold, I think that those are probably the communities that are best equipped to handle sort of being under the target. So that's kind of an interesting, but I'm not sure that we've gotten to a place where that has to be the case for any of the schools, but it just.
Yeah. Sandra, Sandra, your hands up.
Man, I stink at clicking tonight. I'm sorry.
Okay, you're good. You're good.
I guess I can't, when you were zoomed out more on this new comparison that has been provided, it's hard for me to really tell like exactly. I'm wondering on these bottom numbers here, the purple and the light blue. So are we seeing where proposal C is falling short? It's really more in the distance. Is that that we're looking at? Am I looking at that right? I mean, obviously correct me because I'm staring at a small laptop screen and there's 3 things next to each other.
And they're all not very large. Yeah. Jed?
Yeah, proposal C is actually pretty on par with proposal B when it comes to that distance. It's actually proposal A that doesn't do as well as the other two as far as those distant measures there. The purple bar, that's actually one where it's a little bit inverted, and I'm sorry about that, but it's actually better to be a lower number, right? You want to see fewer students or a lower percentage of students who are at those schools
above 80.
that are filled to the brim. And you can actually see, it makes a lot of sense that you tend to see that, correlate negatively with, more schools that are, hitting the enrollment figures that we'd like to see, especially with draft proposal C and the Black and Native and ELL students there. It's really clear in that situation.
Yeah, so
Jed, and Karina, this is Michelle. Do you mind? I'm also looking at it on a.
yeah, I will zoom into each one so that way we can, Jed, maybe you can talk specifically to that.
Like, my question was, if we were going to look at 2 data points on here, one of them would obviously be this purple bar, the percentage of students in schools with 80% utilization, and that we want to be lower. What would be the second if you were going to rank the 2 pieces of data out of these little 4 data points? What are the 2 top?
Well, really the first 2 are really kind of part and parcel. They're just looking at different grade groups.
Okay.
And so I think that, I think that those are actually kind of ranked in order a little bit, right? We'd like to see the minimum enrollment hit. Absolutely. And of course, we don't want to see it get over 80%, but I think that that's probably a little bit of a lower priority to be able to hit that metric than to meet the minimum, so enough services can be provided.
Okay, I just always want to make sure that we're aligning, our impact with the communities that we say we're trying to serve. And so you're saying the first 2 data points are kind of one and the same, and then the purple bar, you want to aim for a lower number, and you want to look at impacts on Black and Native students.
Right. So to
Okay.
kind of answer that, Chair to pass, if you look at proposal A, across the first 2 metrics, those hit those at 100%, right? For the into the future. But they are kind of commensurate with proposal B relative to the 80% utilization. So in proposal B, you're starting to see for Black and Native, you're still relatively high. You're still in the high 90s for Black and Native and ELL students, but you're across the board down at 86 for the middle schools. At the elementary schools, it's kind of the inverse of that. For all students, it's at 95, but there is a greater impact to ELL and Black and Native students. All right, yes. And then the numbers for the purple, which is the 80% utilization, are slightly higher than proposal A, with the exception of ELL. So then looking at proposal C, again, for middle school, your number is the kind of the lowest across all of them for all students, but higher, meeting it better for Black and Native and ELL students in that group. And then your numbers specifically for Black and Native and for ELL students that are above 80% take a precipitous drop, almost half of what you're seeing in the other ones.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay. Sandra.
Super fast comment. I just feel like I need to inject in there just for visibility purposes that proposal A, the purpose and a lot of the boundaries drawn in proposal A were to reach those ResJ benchmarks.
Correct.
Right?
That was the goal. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's it.
D, I think your hand was up next.
I think just to go back to Beth, just saying like sort of how we move forward, it feels like it's a pretty good framework for different ways that these things can look. Like I think there's threads that are really useful. And I think it would be nice to maybe consider like the next time around, like looking at the enrollment numbers. If balanced strands of DLI seems to be where we're landing as something that people can live with and still sort of like restructures the way it is. It feels like we should look at schools like Arleta and Marysville that are pretty under enrolled as possible co-locations, and maybe not at schools that are going to end up over 100%, just to kind of start to refine where some of these numbers are.
Thanks, Steve. I think Kathleen, you're capturing all this still, right? Oh, so you get 30. Oh, shoot, go, Harmony.
I was just gonna say, I'd like to see racial equity measures for ELL students and low SES too, just because of the populations